So I think, Julie, as you'd mentioned, the world can be very complex. And certainly, as I think you and I know, and many of our listeners, as consultants, when you go into organizations, every organization can be quite different, right? It can be quite complex as well. And I think that the key here is that there are certain principles, let's say, that may guide, as you said, sometimes you don't have the answers, but there are maybe recommended processes for maneuvering through complexities. And I think one of my interests is just the idea of science versus applied science and applied research. And I think there's a lot as practitioners to learn, some of the basic fundamentals that are perhaps consistent across organizations and even complex situations and organizations. But that being said, you do talk about in some of your work this idea of the science of attention and engagement for learning.
Yep.
And kind of on this note, can you maybe share some principles that you apply in your work? And I guess maybe this question is also falling into this motivational science category as well, and the idea of motivation. But can you just talk a little bit about the science of attention and engagement and maybe some of the key principles that can be applied in learning settings within organizations?
Yeah. Well, so I'll start with, if I asked you right now, how interested in a scale of 0 to 10 would you be in watching a 5-minute video on printer repair? Where would you rate yourself right now?
At the moment, I'd probably be a 0.
Yeah. And that's mostly what I hear when I ask that question. Okay. So now scenario number 2, your printer's broken and you need to print, the tax returns or whatever to get in the mail. I don't know if anybody mails tax returns still. I'm sure some people do, but let's go with that hypothetical. You need to print your tax returns. They've got to get in the mail today. Your printer's broken. Now, what's your level of interest in watching a 5-minute video on printer repair?
Oh, I'm 11 out of 10.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So third scenario is you're in a classroom in a workshop I'm teaching, and I put a broken printer in front of you. And I say, your task next in this class is to fix this printer. Okay, where are you now on the 0 to 10 scale?
Well, I want to do good in your class, so I'm probably a 10. So I'm probably going to go watch that video.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that one I get, the answers to that one are like 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10, that kind of thing. So pretty much everybody's 0. Every once in a while I get somebody who's like, no, I'm interested in printers. And I'm like, really? Okay. And the difference between those 3 scenarios is not, were those learning materials really engaging? The difference between those 3 scenarios was, can I do something with this information right away? It's the exact same video in all 3 scenarios, right?
Yep.
And it doesn't need to have dancing unicorns and like kittens and stuff. If I have something I need to do with it, I will probably be able to pay attention to it pretty well. And so we have this problem where we're trying to allocate attention all day long. And we're in this constant process of going, is this worth paying attention to? So in the first few minutes of this podcast, people probably said, worth paying attention to? Maybe, maybe not. And some people decided, nope. And some people were like, yeah, I'm in. But we're constantly doing that all day long. And so when we think about the cues that tell people whether or not they should pay attention to something, immediate utility is actually probably the strongest and most important one. There's other stuff, but that's a really big one. Can I do something with this right away? So then when we start to think about learning experiences, we want to ask the question of, can I create a learning experience where you can do something right away, right? So it's a lot easier if I have a broken printer in front of me, even if it's a hypothetical, even if this printer, I don't need to print anything. It's just a class. This is completely a scenario that this broken printer is here, but it's an actual thing that I can do than watching this 5-minute video on printer repair, because we have a preference for, if a reward or consequence comes quickly, that's going to motivate behavior way more than if it's delayed. So a lot of times we're asking people to learn things that they can't use for a long time. Now, in the ideal world, with a lot of stuff, they learn it right before they actually need it. And so we just push the moment of learning out to, we create just-in-time resources that, a little video that they can pull up right before they need to, do the thing. The problem with that is that there's scenarios where that doesn't work. So we don't want people watching the 3-minute video on how to evacuate the building when they should be evacuating the building.
Yeah,
that's not a good answer.
Yeah.
But if it's a 3-minute video on how to run this report and I can just wait until I need to run the report and then watch it, that's probably the best answer rather than, hey, I'm going to make you sit through the whole explanation about how to run this report 6 months before you ever need to run this report. And
Yeah.
so that's the most powerful, indicator of attention is, can I do something with this right away? And even if they don't have a need immediately for this, if you can give people even a simulated task that they need to accomplish, their animal brain, the animal parts of their brains, we're all animals, but you know what I mean? Like doesn't know that it's a simulation. It's like, oh, we're doing a thing. Okay. I'm going to allocate cognitive resources to doing this thing versus I'm listening to something that I'm pretty sure I'm not going to need for a really long time. Like
Yeah.
that's just always going to be a tough uphill battle to get people to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So that's the number one thing. There's other stuff too, like how strongly we feel about something is probably a way that we gauge the importance of a thing. There's a neuroscience researcher, Antonio Damasio, who looks at people who have had damage to the emotional areas of their brain, and it makes them very bad decision makers because in the absence of any kind of feeling about something, like this just feels right to me, or I don't know, this feels a little bit, things like that. We talk about those things. And so, we recognize that it's important, but we sort of forget it when we're creating training materials because we take all of the emotional context out of stuff a lot of times when we're teaching people. So I'm teaching you how to run this report, but at the same time, I'm not thinking about any of the context of that report. Is this a
Yeah.
report that I'm going to use to determine where we might want to do some hours cuts and staffing? Or is this a report where I'm going to use it to go in and make the pitch for increased funding for it? Like, what are the emotional contexts? Why do I care about this? And a lot of times we're like, here's just the procedure for running this report. And it's really hard to care in those
Yeah.
things. And when it's hard to care, it's really hard to allocate your attention. We
Yeah.
have a brain region, the prefrontal cortex, that is the part of your brain that projects out into the future and considers consequences for stuff. But it's more recently evolved. And then we've got a much bigger part of our brain that controls emotions and physicality and, perception in the world and all these kinds of things. And we all know that feeling when you're forcing yourself to pay attention to something. If you're having to force yourself to pay attention to something, so I really need to sit down and read this contract because I have to get this signed because the client's waiting for it, or I really need to sit down and compile my tax, expenses for the accountant, or, I'm leaning heavily on things that are legal or procedural or whatever, because that, and we all know that feeling of forcing yourself to pay attention. And we talk about the limits to people's attention spans, but everybody's binge watching the entire season of whatever on Netflix. People can pay attention for 10 hours if they want to. What they can't probably do is
Yeah.
force themselves to pay attention for 10 hours. So when we're forcing ourselves to pay attention, that's where these things like 3 minutes or 7 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, they start to be this limit to how long somebody can force themselves to focus. And so what we want to do is create environments where they're not forcing themselves, where there's a natural task they're trying to accomplish. It doesn't feel as forced. You don't have to compel yourself to focus. And then it's much easier to maintain intention over longer periods of time.
Fascinating. And Julie, this is a great insight and exactly why we wanted to invite you to the podcast because of your insight and expertise. And, some of the points that you mentioned apply so well and actually apply 100% to ERP organizational change, because a lot of times, typically it's organizations, of course, and it's adult learners, but we'll start training for a go live for a new ERP system. It could be 6 months to a year in advance.
Yeah.
And, you go through your scenarios and you go through what's called conference room piloting and you walk through different processes and you give them work instructions. And, there's a lot there for preparation for a go live to get the organizational team prepared for a go live. But a lot of the points and principles that you're discussing, I actually think that in our field of ERP organizational change, that learning and development, or I should say effective learning and development, is probably one of the biggest areas of improvement in our field for successful ERP organizational change. So I think there's a lot to be learned from my field, from your field, frankly.